I want you to picture a ravine, dark, wet, full of shacks and smoldering fires, the kind of place a city tries not to remember. I want you to picture a summer day in 1936 when a teenager walking through the brush finds what looks like a discarded coat and then realizes it's a human body. This is Kingsbury Run, Cleveland, in the middle of the Great Depression. The killings that followed would come to be called the torso murders, or, by the papers, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. I'm Mara Ellison, and this is Still Unanswered. Today, with Dr. Leon Ramirez, we're going to try to hold all these fragments of victims, of files, of failures, and see what, if anything, can be learned after nearly a century.
Mara, thanks for having me. It's heavy work. The Cleveland torso case is one of those investigations where the forensic record is as much a historical document as it is science, so we have to read it like a book with missing pages.
Leon, before we get into the victims and the messy details of the investigation, set the scene for listeners who aren't Cleveland natives. What's the city like in the 1930s? Why Kingsbury Run?
Okay, so Cleveland was an industrial powerhouse. Steel, shipping on Lake Erie, dense neighborhoods. Then the Depression hits. Factories slow, men lose jobs, families break up. Kingsbury Run is a natural low part of the city, a ravine that becomes essentially urban fringe. People build shacks there, freight yards run alongside it. It's a place for the transient, the jobless, the marginalized. It was also close to the roaring third, bars, brothels, gambling dens. It was, in short, a place authorities looked at with suspicion, not sympathy.
Right. And into that city walks Elliot Ness, a national figure coming off his fame as one of the untouchables. He arrives as safety director in 1935. He's supposed to modernize, to clean up corruption. But the torso murders land on his desk.
They do, and that's crucial. Ness wasn't a homicide detective. He was an administrator, a reformer. But when you have a celebrity in a city on edge, the public looks to them for answers. The pressure to show results was enormous.
And there were bodies. At least a dozen, officially. Many more if you count probable cases. Most of the victims were anonymous. The people society had pushed to the edges. Let's start at the beginning. The case doesn't open neatly. There's the Lady of the Lake, September 1934. Body parts washing ashore near Euclid Beach. Some researchers count her as victim 0. Leon, what about that one?
The Lady of the Lake is complicated. Lower half of a woman's torso and thighs, severely decomposed. Limbs amputated. Some reports suggest chemical treatment, maybe an attempt at preservation. Because decomposition and the state of the remains, identification was impossible. Some experts later linked her to the torso series by method and geography. Others caution against making her a definitive first victim. It's one of those cases where pattern recognition meets wishful thinking.
Pattern recognition is, I think, a good way to describe the investigation as it unfolded. Pieces slowly stitched together by coroners and detectives. The official pattern that emerges through 1935 and 1936 is distinctive. Decapitation, dismemberment, often removal of hands and genitalia to prevent ID, skillful cuts. Leon, when you read the autopsy notes from that era, what stands out to a modern forensic eye?
Two things. First, the precision. Clean cuts, disarticulation at joints, sections removed in ways that suggest someone with knowledge of anatomy. Could be a surgeon, a butcher, someone used to cutting flesh. Second, the absence of defensive wounds in many cases, and the observation that some decapitations appear to be the cause of death. That pattern, if it's consistent across victims, speaks to a killer who was methodical, controlled, and possibly experienced with amputations.
And yet, most victims remained unnamed. Only 3 were positively identified. That anonymity shaped the investigation, and maybe the public's empathy, or lack of it. Let's walk through some of these victims, not to sensationalize, but to put names and people back into the story. Start with Edward Andrassy. Tell us what the records say.
Edward W. Andrassy, found September 23, 1935, at the base of what's called Jackass Hill, not far from Kingsbury Run. He was decapitated and castrated. His head was found buried nearby. He was known to police, a barfly, petty criminal. The other body found near him was an unidentified white male, likely killed weeks earlier. The coroner at the time, Dr. Samuel Gerber, linked the two based on the method. It's the start of a pattern the public could no longer ignore.
Picture, for a moment, the scene. Neighbors, railroad workers, a man walking by and making a discovery that will chain him to memory forever. And then other discoveries. The tattooed man. And I always want to stop and say his real name is unknown. He had 6 tattoos, and they made a death mask. The police plastered that mask and tattoo drawings in newsrooms and traveling displays, hoping someone would come forward. No one did.
Yes, tattooed man's torso and later head were recovered in June 1936. Tattoos like anchors, a butterfly, and a headline detail the names Helen and Paul. You'd think that would lead somewhere. Sailors, family members, port towns, but nothing. The mask exists in the Cleveland Police Museum now. It's haunting. A face made public while the person remains anonymous.
Big Creek victim, discovered in July 1936 by a teenage girl. Leon, I always want to underscore the human angle there. This girl's life, the shock. How did the city react when bodies started being found so routinely?
Panic and morbid fascination. By late 1936, multiple torso-style murders had been discovered. People were afraid to ride trains near Kingsbury Run, to let kids play near the river. Newspapers competed for the most lurid headline. But crucially, the victims being transients and sex workers meant the initial police response wasn't as urgent as it might have been for a more socially visible class of victim. That class bias is central to how the case unfolded.
Let's talk about Dr. Samuel Gerber for a moment, Cuyahoga County coroner. His autopsy reports were meticulous for their time. It's his observations that pushed the idea the killer had surgical skill. What do Gerber's notes show us about cause of death and timing?
Gerber noted clean-cut disarticulations, knife marks on cervical vertebrae in several victims, and in some cases the decapitation looked like the cause of death. He also observed signs that some bodies had been killed at a different location than where they were dumped. Burial, dumping in water, burlap sacks. He was able to link wounds and technique in ways police at the time did not fully leverage. That said, Gerber didn't have the benefit of modern forensics, no DNA, limited toxicology, so his conclusions had to be cautious.
And yet, with Gerber's caution and Ness's public pressure, the city did something dramatic in August 1938. The mass roundup and the burning of the Kingsbury Run shantytowns. We need to spend time on this. I think a lot of listeners will find that moment emblematic. It's policy, theater, and punishment rolled into one.
It was. After the 2 bodies found on August 16, 1938, Ness authorized a house-to-house style roundup of men in the shanty towns. Some 9,000 people questioned over the life of the investigation, but that raid was theatrical. Fire crews burned the shacks. 60-plus men were rounded up. That action was presented as a way to root out the killer, but it primarily displaced and punished the already poor. It's been widely criticized as scapegoating.
I want to pause on that for listeners. Imagine your shelter, your tattered life, being eradicated on the say-so of city officials because your existence made the city uncomfortable. Some said it was necessary for public safety. Others, myself included, see it as a historic injustice. Leon, did that action make any difference in the investigation?
No lasting difference in solving the murders. It did intimidate and terrify the transient community, making it even less likely people would trust law enforcement with information. The raid created a perception of action, which might have been politically important for Ness, but operationally, it failed to catch the killer.
Now, suspects. The two names that always come up are Frank Dolezal and Dr. Francis Sweeney. Let's handle them one at a time. Dolezal, arrested in 1939, confessed, then died suspiciously in jail. Tell us what the files say.
Dolezal was a laborer with ties to some of the victims. He was arrested and reportedly confessed, though that confession was rambling and inconsistent. He later said police beat him and coerced statements. He died in custody August 24, 1939, officially ruled a suicide by hanging, though the physical logistics and the broken ribs found at autopsy make that ruling dubious. Modern historians view Dolezal as likely a scapegoat, someone pressed into a confession to quiet a public outcry.
Scapegoat. Yeah. And Dolezal's death, those broken ribs, seem to point to brutality in custody. It feels familiar in a terrible way. When systems are under pressure, they often pick the most available victim to close the narrative. Then there's Dr. Sweeney. Leon Sweeney is the suspect people talk about in hushed tones. Ness believed him privately. Polygraph tests, wartime surgical experience, postcards sent after institutionalization. But the evidence is thin. Walk us through Sweeney.
Francis Edward Sweeney was a trained physician who served in World War I performing field amputations. He had known trauma and later struggled with alcoholism and erratic behavior. Ness had him secretly interrogated. Sweeney reportedly failed early polygraph tests administered by Leonard Keeler, and Keeler told Ness he believed Sweeney was the killer. Sweeney eventually ended up in mental institutions and veterans hospitals, and is said to have sent taunting postcards to Ness, though those accounts are part of the mythos and are debated. The core problem: no direct physical evidence tied Sweeney to the crimes. Polygraphs and proximity don't make admissible proof.
So here's the ethical puzzle I always come back to. After Sweeney's death in 1964, many people were ready to name him as the butcher. But are we comfortable labeling a dead man a serial killer based on polygraphs and suspicion? Or are we doing that because we want closure? And what does that do to the victim's memory?
That's the central question. From a historian's perspective, Sweeney is the most plausible single suspect. Skill set, location, timing. But plausibility is not proof. The risk is twofold. We may wrongly condemn a man posthumously, and we may substitute a satisfying narrative for the work of answering who these victims were. The ethical priority, I would argue, is to identify the victims first, name them, so they stop being props in a story about a famous man and become the people they were.
Exactly. And that's where modern developments come in. In 2024, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office worked with DNA Doe Project to exhume unidentified victims from Pottersfield. That is, it feels like a corrective, doesn't it? Going after the nameless instead of the mythic butcher.
It absolutely is a corrective. We now have tools, genetic genealogy, that can identify remains by matching their DNA to distant relatives. But there are limits. Environmental degradation, missing evidence, and the fact that the killer may have left no recoverable DNA means we may identify victims without ever identifying the offender. Even so, restoring names after nearly 90 years has enormous value. It gives families answers and recenters the narrative on human lives.
Let's zoom in on one of the more haunting case details. The victim, whose autopsy showed morphine in her system, found in the Cuyahoga in 1938. That suggests drugging, maybe an attempt to control or sedate victims. Leon, how unusual is that detail, and what does it tell us about the killer's methods?
Finding morphine, about 0.002 grams per 100 grams of tissue, suggests the woman ingested or was injected with the drug before death or shortly before being dismembered. It's an outlier because most other victims didn't have that marked chemical evidence. It raises questions. Was the killer experimenting with chemical control? Did he have access to morphine, perhaps through medical channels? Or was this just one victim's personal habit? It's suggestive, not conclusive.
Suggestive, not conclusive. That's a refrain through this case. The evidence invites theories, but usually stops short of proof. Let's pause for a minute. Leon, tell me about the human moments that aren't in the headlines, like the diver sent into that sewer-like pond at East 37th, or the teenage girl at Big Creek who found a body. These are the moments that get lost in the mad butcher mythology.
When you read Coroner Gerber's notes and the newspaper accounts, there's this inversion. You have grotesque details, yes, but then you also find traces of ordinary grief. A diver sent into a foul pond to retrieve remains. A crowd of 600 people watching police dredge the ravine. Families who never got an answer. The teen who found a body. Imagine the trauma. Those are the things that didn't make good headlines because they didn't feed the myth. But they deserve our focus.
Yes, and the media competing Cleveland papers heightened the panic. Mad Butcher was a headline that sold papers, not a clinical term. That sensationalism shaped public memory and probably pushed officials towards symbolic actions like the shantytown burning. Leon, do you think media pressure helped or hindered the investigation?
Both. The papers kept the story in public consciousness, which forced political actors to act. Ness reorganized resources, detectives were under scrutiny. But sensationalism pushed for quick answers, sometimes at the expense of careful work. It fostered a climate where scapegoats were useful. So media attention created momentum, but not always the right kind.
And then there are the alternative theories we must mention. Jack Wilson, the butcher theory, or the idea of multiple killers. Some detectives thought a local butcher could have performed the dismemberments. Others saw subtle differences and postulated copycats or multiple offenders. What's your evaluation, Leon?
The butcher theory has merit. The killer's cuts could have been done by someone accustomed to cutting meat. But a trained physician's knowledge of anatomy could replicate similar patterns too. As for multiple killers, that's a harder sell. There are signature consistencies across the main 1934-1938 cases that argue for a single perpetrator. That said, the disposal methods varied. A body left in the ravine, another wrapped in a burlap sack in the river, so there might have been opportunistic differences, or even someone adapting their method over time.
Listeners, this is where we need your patience. It's tempting to demand a single clean answer. Who was the butcher? But the truth is messy. I want to shift to something more personal. Leon, you've worked with modern cold case teams and with the DNA Doe Project. What does the exhumation process feel like, emotionally and scientifically, when you're digging up cases this old?
It's a mix of reverence and method. Scientifically, you go in with protocols, careful documentation, contamination prevention, careful sampling for viable DNA. Emotionally, it's heavy. You're touching remains that have been waiting for a name for decades. There's a sense of responsibility, not to sensationalize, but to restore dignity. You think about the families, about the lives that were cut off. That's the only way I can describe it, a privilege and a burden.
People listening should know how important that is. Giving a name back to someone who has been John Doe for 90 years changes the story. It reframes this from a horror saga to a series of personal tragedies. Now, real talk. Can these exhumations lead to identifying the killer, or is that dream unlikely?
Real talk. Identifying the killer is a long shot. Many pieces of physical evidence from the original investigations have been lost or degraded. DNA from bones exposed to water and soil for decades can be difficult to recover in usable form. Even if you get victim DNA and identify family lines, you still need a link to a perpetrator, something that ties a suspect's DNA to the crime scene or body. The killer could have had no surviving biological trace on the remains. So we might get names for victims, which is huge, but we may never get the identity of the offender.
It's a sobering reality. But identifying victims still matters. It changes the narrative. It answers the question, who were these people, more than who killed them? I want to ask you about the ethics of storytelling in cases like this. We're true crime journalists. We've both seen how a compelling villain can eclipse victims. How do you balance public interest with respect?
You center the victims. You avoid lurid detail that serves only to titillate. You interrogate systems, the social conditions, the police missteps, and you confront uncertainty without filling it with invented certitudes. And you name the limits of the evidence. If you do that, I think you can tell the story compellingly without exploiting tragedy.
That's what we try to do on Still Unanswered. Listeners, some of you may be wondering about Ness himself, how he coped. He was a reformer and a celebrity, and the torso case hurt him politically. He even had personal scandals, and then he leaves Cleveland. In many narrative retellings, Ness becomes a tragic figure too. Do you think that's fair, Leon?
Partly. Ness was a symbol. People invested in him a kind of near-mythic competence. When he failed to solve the butcher, it was a blow to the city's sense of order. But Alan Ness was a human. He made errors, and some decisions, like the shantytown burning, that were misjudged. The tragedy is that his reputation and the victim's sufferings became enmeshed. He gets blamed for being human in a situation that may have been unsolvable with the tools of the time.
Let's return, briefly, to Dr. Sweeney and the postcards. Some accounts say he taunted Ness for years from institutions. Some say the postcards are embellished or apocryphal. If they are real, what weight do they carry?
If authenticated, the postcards are provocative, taunting communications from someone with proximity to the crimes could be meaningful. But we need corroboration, handwriting analysis, provenance, dates. Postcards alone are circumstantial. In the Sweeney story, they feed a narrative that many wanted to be true. Ness had been right all along. But as historians, we have to be careful not to let the seductive drama of a man mailing taunts replace proper evidence.
Yeah, seductive drama. That's how myths are made. Now, another listener question. Could the torso butcher have simply moved on, died, imprisoned for another crime, or relocated and changed MO? What's your read?
All three are possible. If the killer was older, he could have died. If he was institutionalized, Again, Sweeney fits that timeline. He could have been removed from circulation. Or he could have left the city and changed methods. There were dismemberment murders in other states later on that some have tried to connect, but those links are speculative. Without DNA ties or a paper trail, it's conjecture.
I want us to talk about the social memory of this case, how it's been represented in pop culture. There's Brian Michael Bendis's graphic novel Torso, upcoming Netflix interest, podcasts, and academic work. Is there a risk that new adaptations exploit the horror, or can they help refocus on justice and victims?
Both. Popular culture can bring attention and funding to cold cases, which is good. It can also simplify and sensationalize, amplifying the killer as a monstrous figure without context. The best adaptations, in my view, are those that use the platform to restore dignity to victims and interrogate the failures of institutions.
We have to be careful not to turn this into entertainment at the expense of people who suffered. Okay, let's get into some specifics listeners often ask about, the supposed hesitation marks and the skillfulness of the cuts. These details make people imagine either a doctor or a butcher. Is there any forensic nuance that leans us one way or the other?
Hesitation marks, small, shallow cuts, can indicate a perpetrator unsure or tentative at first. But coroners also saw clean joint disarticulations, incisions at anatomical joints, and cuts through cervical vertebrae. That suggests familiarity. A butcher would be adept at disarticulating at joints. A surgeon would understand vertebrae and anatomy more deeply. Both are plausible. The big difference would be an incision pattern that matched surgical techniques. If Gerber had noted such, we'd have stronger evidence pointing to a physician. What we mostly have is unmistakable skill, but not a signature that conclusively identifies the killer's profession.
Listeners, I want to ask you to imagine one last scene with me. August 16, 1938. 2 bodies found within sight of City Hall. That felt like a direct provocation for the city, for Ness, for everyone. What do you make of that day, Leon?
It was symbolic. Finding those 2 bodies in daylight, under the nose of municipal power, read like a message. The killer could strike anywhere, including at the edge of authority. Whether the killer intended to taunt isn't provable, but the psychological effect was real. It intensified the pressure and produced the shantytown burning. It also remains one of those moments where the narrative and the city's politics braided together.
We're approaching the end of our time, but I want to leave listeners with the things we cannot let be forgotten. First, the victims. Second, the systemic failures. Class bias, sensational journalism, political theater. Third, the modest promise of modern science. DNA exhumations will bring names to some of the dead, if not the killer. Leon, any final forensic observations?
Just this. I hope listeners understand that cold cases are more than puzzles. They are social artifacts. Scientific techniques can help, but they won't fix the inequalities that let victims vanish in the first place. Identifying victims is an ethical task as much as a scientific one.
And my final thought, closure is a complicated word. For some families, it might mean a name on a grave marker. For a city, it might mean a suspect named. For historians, it might mean a plausible narrative. But for the victims, closure would have been life. We can't give them that. What we can do is stop treating them as footnotes in a sensational story and start restoring the dignity of who they were. Leon, thank you. This was grim but necessary.
Thank you, Mara. It's necessary work. And to listeners, if you have tips or family lore, if your relatives disappeared from the Midwest in the 1930s and you want to know more, contact your local historical society. You never know what a name might unlock.
One last thing before we go. When the DNA teams exhume those Potter's Field graves, they're not just opening boxes of bone. They're opening a possibility of reckoning. That doesn't mean the Mad Butcher will be unmasked. It does mean that a few men and women who made Cleveland's margins their home might get the simple, human thing they deserve: a name. This is still unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Leon Ramirez, thanks for joining me. If you found today's episode heavy, that's the point. These are heavy matters. We'll come back next week with another case that history hasn't closed. And for those who want to read more, our episode notes list primary sources from the Cleveland Police Museum, contemporary newspapers, and the recent 2024 Plain Press piece on exhumations. Please respect the victims. Think about the human cost. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye, Mara. Take care.